we're talking about life at the intersection of God's kingdom and human organizations. And what we want to think about in this session is in Daniel chapter 2, we have a depiction of how we can go about developing a mindset, a kind of character that invites revelation. In other words, that invites God to grant the sorts of insight that enable you to see what's really going on in a place in such a way that it can transform that situation. So those kind of life-giving insights that they occur in the human mind, but they don't really just come from the human mind. Okay? And as you go through the book of Daniel, each of the chapters deals with basic issues that come up as we live from God's kingdom in the midst of different human hierarchies and organizations. And often there's kind of two issues interacting or two poles that have to be brought in contact with each other. And in Daniel chapter 2, the two poles, or the kind of two big questions that it's dealing with, are, on the one hand, what is it that endures and what vanishes, right? What really lasts? Because if you can answer that says something about what's worth living for. Right? You want to live for things that last, not for things that are here today, gone tomorrow. And then the other big question is where does revelation, where does genuine insight come from? What's the source of that? And the answer to both of those questions is the kingdom of God, actually. The kingdom of God is the one thing that really lasts. The human organizations come and go. They have a kind of a temporary footprint, a temporary set of things to accomplish, and God makes use of them, and so they're here for a while, but they don't ultimately last. And real knowledge, real insight, real wisdom, that comes from God. Now, in this session, we're going to focus on the question of revelation. Okay, but it's intertwined with issues that have to do with what it is that lasts, right? And we'll pick that up because that continues into chapter 3, so we'll pick that up in our next session. So for this one, how do we become the sort of people, the sort of persons to whom God could safely and beneficially give insight, could reveal mysteries, could give kind of uncanny abilities to recognize what's really going on and to see the way forward. And this question is answered as we go throughout Daniel chapter 2 through the example of Daniel. Now, backstory here. What's going on in Daniel chapter 2 is King Nebuchadnezzar, second year of his reign, has a perplexing dream, and he can't make sense of it, and for some reason it gets under his skin and it bothers him. He finds himself sleepless, he finds himself agitated, and this leads him, in large part because of his distrust of the wise men, this intellectual class in Babylon. He not sure what they're up to, doesn't really trust them, and so this leads him to make some irrational demands. He really gets kind of crazy, right? What he says is, I've had a dream, you need to tell me what the dream is and the interpretation, right? Because fundamentally, he knows that these are guys that they'll come up with an answer if he demands an answer, and so he wants insight that he can trust, but coming from people that he fundamentally does not. Right? Now, this is an issue that comes up in a lot of human organizations, doesn't it? And so, because they cannot, nobody could, in purely human terms, meet that demand, he gives this very rash command that this whole class be wiped out. All of the wise men are going to be killed. And this is where it intersects with Daniel and his friends. So the executioner comes knocking on Daniel's door. And again, we see Daniel's character coming to the surface here because he responds with the same sort of discretion that we had found in him before. And instead of running or instead of freaking out, he simply, asks why the severity, what's going on. And when he hears of this, he makes a request of the king. And so, long reading, but let's look at chapter 2 and verses 17 through 30. Because in this, we begin to see the three primary features of that mindset that's receptive to revelation. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, in order that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. And Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. And it is he who changes times and epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who it's he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what's in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you've given me wisdom and power. Even now, you've made known to me what we requested of you, for you've made known to us the king's matter." Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows: "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king." Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows: "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can give the interpretation to the king." The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" And Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your heart on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turned to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than any other living person, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you might understand the thoughts of your heart." We see a few features of this mindset, this character, to whom God can safely and beneficially reveal things. The first thing that we see here is that Daniel is prayerfully and humbly rooted in God's compassion. It's that phrase, the compassion of God, comes up several times throughout this reading. And it's important because you see, what Daniel understands is that God's compassion is the source of his revelation. Okay? Fundamentally, the reason that God speaks to human beings, the reason that he opens windows into what's going on in ways that are beyond what humans could understand on their own, is because of his compassion for us. Okay? He looks upon us in our plights. He sees what we're going through. He knows we're in over our head even when we can't admit it to ourselves. And out of compassion, he reveals. He gives direction. And it's clear as you read through this that Daniel, he gets this about God. He understands God's character in this way. And this is one of the reasons why he's a suitable recipient of what God would say. He's very forthright about this. He knows that the reason that he has these insights is not because he's smarter than any of these other guys in this intellectual class in Babylon. He looks around. These guys are all as smart as I am. Some of them are smarter. That's not where this comes from. Right? The only reason that I know this, that I can see this, that this insight has been given, he says, is because of God's compassion, that he's willing to pass this on. And he's very forthright. Part of what this means is that if we want to be the sort of people to whom God could speak, we need to know and become comfortable sharing with others the fact that insight is more a gift than it is an achievement. Okay? That when we're granted to make connections and see how things fit together, that's simply a sign that God's mercy is upon not only us, but through us on the people that we're working with and we're there for. And so that's what Daniel is doing here. First of all, he's rooted himself in the compassion of God. And the second thing is we see kind of a communal dimension to this. Okay? In verse 17 and 18, we find that Daniel has been nurturing a small group of friends, and he's leaning into this community of people who are prayerful and who together have this understanding of God's compassion as kind of the central thing driving God's project and their place within it. And so he gathers them and he says, okay, we got to pray. And it's interesting whom they address here. This is another phrase alongside God's compassion. The other thing that you find beginning here, and it runs throughout the book, is that God's referred to as the God of heaven. Right? So they request compassion from the God of heaven. And then later, Daniel, after the mystery has been revealed, he blesses the God of heaven. And then when he stands before the king, he says it's the God of heaven. What's behind that phrase, the God of heaven? It actually only arises, we find it coming up in exilic literature. Before that, God speaks from heaven, he does that. But as a phrase, a kind of a primary way of thinking about God, it doesn't show up until that moment when the nation is turned and Israel has been destroyed. The temple where God was to meet his people, they can't go there anymore. And now they find themselves in a foreign land. And where do they meet God? I mean, that's what's behind this phrase. You could translate this word heaven as sky, but you can also translate it as atmosphere. It's a way of talking about, as it were, what you're walking through. When you wiggle your toes, what they're moving through is the lowest level of the heavens in biblical terms. Okay? So who is the God of heavens? The God of the heavens is the God who is around us all the time, wherever you go. He's the God that was not confined to the temple that's been destroyed. He's the God who shows up wherever you're at in your exile. He's the God that's closer than your next breath. And what they find is that when there's no king that they can turn to, there's no temple that they can cry out from, when they just cry out to the God of their fathers, it turns out that he's there right around them, okay? And he's ready to speak to them out of heaven, or I guess we might say out of thin air, right? He's right there, he's right here, okay? And so this is an understanding, or it's an experience of God and God's closeness that develops. It comes to clarity because of all of the external trappings being stripped away. And I think we often experience this, right? We get up and go, and we've been used to meeting God in certain kind of standard ways in the places we came from, and we find ourselves living in a new place, and he shows up in ways that maybe we weren't used to meeting him, but we find that he's there, okay? So the second characteristic of the revelation receptive mind is that it leans into a community that together is dependent upon the God of heaven, okay, the God who's there moment by moment right where you're at. And then finally, what we find is as they face God, they're rooted in God's compassion, and they understand that that's the motive out of which God will reveal things. But as they face the people that they're working with and for, and the human organizations that they're employed by, we find Daniel and his friends have a care for those people that they're working with and for, that is a primary motivation as they seek to learn from God, to gain insight. They care about these other people and their well-being. And there's purpose clauses here that give us a little window into Daniel's and his friends' motivation. And this is really important because it turns out that for God to reveal something to a person, where their heart is at, what their motive is in seeking that revelation really matters. Okay, so look at these two purpose clauses. You have one of them in verse 18. It says, when he calls his friends together for them to pray, they pray so that not only Daniel and his friends, but that the rest of the wise men of Babylon might not be destroyed. There's a care for all of these, in this case, pagan, magicians and conjurers and so forth, that they live among. They care for these other people, and they don't want them destroyed because of the madness of the king at this moment. And so they're praying for compassion on these particular people. And you see this later, that when Daniel receives the revelation and he goes to Arioch, the executioner, he doesn't say, "Don't kill me." He says, "Stop, don't kill the wise men. The God of heaven is revealed." Okay, so in Daniel's own heart and mind, in his consciousness, what he's seeking from God is what is going to be of help to somebody else. And he's kind of put himself out of the way, and he's thinking as he interacts with God of what is good for these people and of what's good for the king. And you see this, the second purpose clause is in verse 30. When he's speaking to the king and he's going to reveal this bizarre dream that we'll talk about in the next session. We won't actually talk about the dream in this one in its details. He says, "Now as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me because of any wisdom residing in me more than any other person, but for the purpose of, in order that, what? In order that may make known to the king the interpretation so that you can understand the thoughts of your heart. He understands and has that God in his compassion would care for the king, the person whose decisions have an impact over the course, over thousands, perhaps millions of lives. He cares that this king could have clarity to be able to make decisions that are profitable and right and good for those that he's responsible for. And so it turns out that actually caring for others, not just as kind of a side thing, that it'd be nice if somebody else got something out of this too, but having that as your primary motivation, that's a prerequisite for being the kind of person on the inside to whom God could reveal, could grant these insights. And so there's this paradox that emerges, that God-given insight enables a person to understand what other people cannot, and very often that results in the person who has passed on those insights being recognized and promoted, and they move up in the human hierarchies that they're a part of. Okay? But the only way that insight can be given to a person is if that moving up and promotion and all of that is nowhere in their own mind or ambition. Okay? God can only grant the insight to a person who wants it for the sake of being an extension of God's compassion and caring for the people around him, around her. Okay? As I was reading through this, what struck me is a similarity to this scene that you get in the first Harry Potter, actually. Remember, at the end of the first one, there's the Mirror of Erised, I think is what it was called, where when you look at it, it shows you whatever it is that you want, and Dumbledore has it rigged, enchanted, whatever it is, to where that the person who looks at that mirror and he wants to find the Philosopher's Stone, but not use it, then it shows up, right? But if they want to use it for them, want to benefit out of it themselves, they can't get it, right? And there's something similar going on in this, that the person who is looking for the good of others, God gives revelation to, and that has kind of secondary results that involve promotion and effectiveness in human organizations. But if that's what the person is aiming at, it's not really safe for God to give this kind of insight, this kind of revelation. And so what we find here, Daniel's heart aims simply to be useful for others under God. Okay? And it's that purity of heart that makes him the person to whom God can grant insight that's needed for this kingdom to carry on and to move forward. So just kind of, we could ask this question. Yeah, please.
Could you integrate that thought with the previous one from the last lesson, where someone who is seeking this insight, this revelation for the benefit of others, the heart is so oriented such, and how that person is also someone who's trying to negotiate that path of not selling out or assimilating, which probably would include that kind of ambition.
Right.
Ambition,
Yeah.
and also one that is not so separate, and we could say even obnoxious, that they're irrelevant, which is in of itself, I guess, another ambition that doesn't fully benefit others.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit of how we see Daniel evolving into this kind of person.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think one aspect of it is that Daniel sees that he's of the most help by not just being like everybody else, right? So if he just kind of joins in the rat race and decides to compete with the rest of the intelligentsia of Babylon and to one up and to push for position and all of that, then ultimately he'll be of no real value, no real use, either to God's project or to the human beings there. Because part of what God would give through him is the fact that he's living out of this reality of God in the world that nobody else is in a position to understand, or very few. He's got some other friends. And so I think part of what brings those together, negotiating that space for being kind of good guests in the culture and learning to operate well in ways that are respectful and loving and fluent, but still, recognizing that you're never going to be that. You're not going to be native. Part of that is simply rooted in the sense that God will use you for what you are within his kingdom. And so learning to live out of that, I think, is what's important here. And so that's kind of the question I think we all need to ask as we read this. Do we want to receive those insights, to be the sort of person to whom God could safely and beneficially enable to see what's going on below the surface and to speak to that? And if we do, it turns out that the primary thing that we need to do is put ourselves out of the way. Is to put ourselves out of the way. We prayerfully ask for God's compassion on the situation, and many of the parables of Jesus are about the compassion of God as the primary motive from which he acts, and we learn to act with him. So we pray for compassion, knowing that that's how God views us in our plight. And then we focus on the good of the people and the organizations we're in. We have to actually care about it, whether that's a business or a school or whatever it is. We've got to care about it and about those people. And then we wait, because God will answer. He will answer. He will guide if we, with this compassionate, loving, outward focused heart, ask, he will reveal. And then the little secret that comes along with this is that when we give ourselves over to working with God in that way, just for the good of others, to be extensions of his compassion, he takes care of us along the way. Just because God's that good. So it turns out it's actually safe to forget yourself. You can do that. You don't have to be watching your own back, because that's God's job. You can look at just what's good for the people you're interacting with and act out of God's compassion, because that compassion that you're living from for the sake of others is larger than that, and he's going to overshadow and take care of you as well. And so we see this. We haven't described all of this yet. We'll pick up this vision again in the next session. But we see that Daniel's response leads to promotion. Okay? So Daniel's taken care of as well. But his focus is simply to take care of others.
Excellent. Awesome.
Okay. Questions or comments?
I think for a lack of a better term, it's a rather bold statement to make, that God will reveal
Yeah.
and give that kind of insight and clarity to the one who is committed to serving others for it to benefit others.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say more on this, but I felt that was a very compelling statement, a very strong statement, a very clear statement. That's what God is looking for, and He will reveal to that, which goes back to the character. You know, that's why there is a story here of the development of the character of these men, or boys to men.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Because, you know, Daniel isn't just a collection of bizarre stories about people that have special capacities that you and I never will. That's not what this is about. This rather is about how God has taken kind of three intelligent, well-born people, yes, but through a very difficult situation, and then has developed them to be His instruments to work in a place that they did not choose, but that He has something for them to do there. So, yeah.
I mean, I find it interesting too. I think related to maybe our culture in Christianity today, I think most people in Daniel's position would actually be praying against these other magicians and people because their beliefs and their practices would be viewed as a threat to God's kingdom.
Yeah.
But in his position, he actually intercedes on their behalf.
That's right. Yeah, good point. And I didn't mention it as I went through this, but you'll notice as you read through the book of Daniel that although Daniel is for these other people and he's caring for them, they are not looking out to take care of Daniel. Very often they're looking out to get rid of Daniel because they view him as a threat and a competitor, whereas he views them as people for whom he's responsible in some way of seeking their good. And so he's approaching them in a very different way than they are approaching him. But it's because he knows that he lives under the shadow of the God of heaven that he can risk seeking the good of even those people who are seeking his harm. Right? And, you know, it's interesting that Daniel was not there among the wise men that were called in initially. You may ask why. You know, they're not inviting him in because they don't want him moving ahead, right? They view him as a competitor, but he doesn't view them that way. And so, and I think that's why he's the one that God's going to speak to, is because he can view them as those for whom he has a responsibility under God rather than just kind of tit for tat responding in kind in competition. Yeah, excellent. Thank you.